Chesca is the co-founder and former CEO of MiracleFeet, a global health NGO that has changed the lives of over 100,000 children around the world by providing treatment for a common birth defect called Clubfoot. Chesca credits her accomplishments to her childhood growing up in Africa and Asia, as well as a varied career in business from investment banking to internet startups, as these experiences provided her with the motivation and skills needed to build a high-impact global non-profit. In today's episode, we will talk to Chesca and will discover more about her journey. So let's get started. Welcome, Chesca, to this episode of Unstoppables. Thank you so much for taking out time for us. It's an honor to have you on this episode.
Well, thank you so much, Sharatul, for inviting me. I'm very excited to share my story and have a great conversation today.
Thank you. So, Jessica, my first question, which I ask every guest, is that what does unstoppable mean to you in your life?
Yeah, that I thought about that a lot, given the title of your show.
Right.
And I think for me, it's a feeling of utter conviction. When you fall onto an idea, you get an idea and you see that there's a way forward and that there's a solution for that if it's a problem. So you feel utterly compelled to do this. And by feeling so sure of yourself, by having incredible confidence that this is important, this matters, and you have a way to drive it forward, I think you're able to bring lots of other people along with you, and start pushing through some of those hurdles. So it kind of empowers you. The idea and your own conviction about it empowers you to operate at a higher level of energy. And I think that's when you become unstoppable and you feel unstoppable.
Yeah. 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 When you were talking about it, I reflected one of the things that you said is so important that it's just not about you, that, you bring collectively the whole community and people around you and empower them. That's such an important point, Jessica.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think I sort of understood this when I started talking to people to raise money. And
right.
I would have these conversations, and afterwards, inevitably, the feedback was like, wow, you're so passionate about this. Like, how could I not support you because you are coming across as so passionate? And I didn't even know that that's what was happening. I was just being myself, right? I was just like, I truly believed, and there's something about that coming across in a very authentic, natural way that I think then makes people want to join, sign up and come along for the journey.
Right. Yeah. And we will talk a lot about that when we come to that segment, because I want to explore a lot about that specifically, that area of your expertise and leadership. But before we go to that segment, we discussed, especially in Unstoppables, chapters of your life where you face challenges and how that shaped your journey. And I think, as a part of your journey, the first and foremost segment that I want to start with is that, you lost your mother quite early on. And if you could take us through that chapter of your life and how that shaped your journey forward.
Yeah. Definitely had a big impact. So as I explained to you, I grew up living in mostly in Africa and Asia as a child because of my father's work.
Yeah.
And my mother was definitely the trailing spouse. She was there because of my father's job, but she always threw herself into whatever community we were living in through volunteer work
Right.
and really kind of sought out people that where she could make a difference, opportunities where she could make a difference, thanks to the privilege that she had and the position that she had in the community, but really kind of loved being supporting the underdog and sought that out in a very real way. She just preferred being with those people rather than with, in the diplomatic scene and the rest of it, which was the other part of her life. So she was a really important role model to me, and I would be dragged along, sometimes not always happily, to go to events at the school for disabled children she was working at, or going to the church to do volunteer work or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But it was just part of life, right? And then, unfortunately, my mother, while being incredibly gregarious and very much a person other people wanted to follow and wanted to emulate. She also suffered from bipolar depression, and that was also part of our lives and not easy. And when I was about 28, she committed suicide, which, of course, was utterly devastating. So I had a few things that kind of I think influenced who I came to be and also my desire to make a difference. The first was just growing up in these countries and seeing the incredible difference in opportunities that most people had compared to what I had. And I
Hmm.
just had something inside me that felt at some point in my life I had to do something about that. Not, I
Right.
mean, it was never going to solve it, but in a small way to make a difference for people who, especially children, who lived with very different opportunities and resources than I had. Then so I had that embedded in me. My mother definitely influenced it. When I lost my mother, I realized that we don't always have the luxury of time, and it's not okay to just always wait and assume that we'll do that at some point in our lives because, life is incredibly unpredictable and you don't really know what's around the next corner. And that was reinforced by the loss of my mother, and I think made this idea that at some point I needed to make a difference in the world and have an impact that gave back and was not just about my own career or about how much money I was earning or what position I held. So losing her kind of amplified that. It turned up the heat a little bit on that, and made me realize you can't always wait. A, because you may not have the time in the future, and then the other part of it. Oh, and B because yeah, you just don't know what's coming around the next corner. But the other part of that was feeling a need to honor her and a
Hmm.
feeling that while I'm not a religious person at all, but I had this feeling that I needed to make her proud, even though she wasn't physically here on this earth, that I needed to live my life in a way that reflected well on everything she'd invested in me and that would honestly make her proud. And I have this vision of her sort of looking down and being like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess I give you pretty good marks on making me proud. I wanted to make sure that I did something that made her proud, even though she was no longer here to witness it in person.
Yeah. And maybe the foundation of Miracle Feet was set long before it actually started as a child with your experiences in Asia and Africa, and then with your mother and her work. And it just unfolded later on in life, but I think the foundation was set long, long before.
I think that's right. And it didn't have to be Clubfoot, it didn't have to be Miracle Feet, but it needed
Yeah,
to be something like that.
yeah, yeah, totally. But Cheska, you were a Stanford GSB graduate, and then you worked in corporate for a long time with Goldman Sachs and many, many big names. And with such a brilliant career, and of course, the mainstream career that people really get attached to, you took a different turn, and then Miracle Feet happened. So take us through that journey, because that is very interesting to me personally. Because once you get out of Stanford, Harvard, Columbia, all these Ivy League schools, so to say, you have a very, very um, uh, let's say mainstream mindset that you want to make a lot of money, you get into big companies, big roles, but then you chose a different career path altogether. So take us through that journey.
Yeah, I think I never really bought into that. So for me, I was very, very lucky and I was able to get these jobs with companies that were very sought after and I did well in those environments and I enjoyed working with very smart people and in sometimes on high profile deals and that kind of thing. I loved it. I also learned a ton and I'm very grateful for that time. But it also never ever felt like that was me. It didn't feel genuine. It felt like this is a temporary piece of my life that I'm doing because it makes sense for lots of reasons. I needed to earn some money to support my husband, who was getting his PhD and starting a career in academia. I needed to be in certain locations, so that sort of prevented me from going off and working, maybe for the World Bank or the UN, which might have been where my head was. Um, and it also just felt like, okay, I can do this for a while and then I can move on. So whenever I was in those places, that even though on the surface it all looked good and I was doing well and people thought, oh, she's going to stay here for a long time. In my heart of hearts, I always knew this was not who I was and this was not what I was put on this earth to do. And that was okay. It was temporary as long as I never lost the drive and that desire to be really genuine to myself and to the things that mattered to me. So while I was in those positions, if anybody, had gotten people who got close to me and people who I sort of, would confide in, I would be very honest that this is sort of temporary. It makes sense right now. It gets me the visa I need as a British citizen to be in the United States. There were a lot of practical considerations. So I always was looking for something else, and I always, I and I, yeah, I always knew that I wasn't going to be internally satisfied with just continuing to be promoted and move through the corporate world. And so I was always looking for that other thing, but it's hard to find.
Yeah.
And so it's especially once you've embarked on a career, and I didn't have practical skills like being a doctor or being a nurse or being a teacher. And so looking around and kind of like, how am I going to make a difference? How am I going to have the kind of impact that feels true to who I am? Wasn't very easy. And that was kind of concerning and worrying to me. And I would have lots of conversations with my husband, like, I can do this for now, but at some point I've got to get back to what I really believe I need to do to feel good about myself. So that shift away from the corporate world, when it happened, felt enormously. I was with a sense of relief
Hmm.
that finally I'm doing what I always said I was going to do, and that what I felt was closer to where my heart was. Um, and so, yeah, there was definitely a feeling of relief when I had this amazing conversation that I think you and I talked through when I was sitting
Yeah.
in my office at the University of Iowa, and a donor walked in and told me about this doctor who'd been working away at the University of Iowa for decades and had come up with a new way to treat this condition called clubfoot. I knew nothing about clubfoot. I didn't know it was a problem. I had read about this doctor, so I did know a little bit about him. But suddenly, all these jigsaw puzzle pieces seemed to fit together, which was, wow, this is happening right here. I don't know why we were, it seemed odd that we have moved to Iowa, but now it was like, oh, there was a reason we had to move to Iowa. Um, and here's an opportunity that is being handed to me kind of on a platter as we need help. And we think someone like you who has strategy experience and understands health systems in low income countries just from growing up in those places, maybe you could help. And it suddenly made sense to me. And I felt like the doctor had done the difficult part, which was to come up with a new treatment. And the what was needed now was really implementation. It was operational skills for figuring out how to get that disseminated, how to get the new treatment out there to the people that needed it most. And that felt like a skill set I had. So it was suddenly like, wow, maybe I could actually do this. Maybe this is where I can make a difference.
Yeah. No, when you were just narrating this, in the hindsight, when we look back, the dots always connect, and maybe that whole career and that arc that you went through with the working with Goldman Sachs and other big companies, that is what made Miracle Feed so successful and what it is today operationally, because all of that experience contributed to you building such a successful organization. Probably it wouldn't have been this big if it was to just be started with someone with just passion, because those skills that you build over the experience that you build over that time, I think contributed a big deal. So maybe it happened at the time and at the right time, and you were always meant to do it. But yeah, I mean, the universe just conspired it to bring it to the right point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. And I look back on the things that I did right and the things that worked really well. And it was very clear to me that I was drawing very heavily from all of that experience. In addition to that, I had these networks of people I had developed over that
Yes.
time that I could then go back to for both advice, but also as donors and as people who could get involved as board members and so forth. So it all did make
Yeah.
sense afterwards, and you do join the dots, and I think you do look back and you make a narrative that works to based on what's actually happened in your life. But I really believe that if I had tried to create Miracle Feet in the early days, I wouldn't have been as successful, and we would not have been able to create the lasting organization that we've created. But it also all felt very, just going back to that moment when I had this conversation, I had a very visceral reaction to being told about it. I burst into tears at my desk as I watched this video that this gentleman showed me about the issue of Clubfoot. And and I went home that night and I said to my husband, I know what I have to do with my life. I mean, it really felt like a very clear, it wasn't sort of a maybe, it wasn't ambiguous. It was like, I've just been given an extraordinary opportunity and I
Yeah.
know that I need to do this. I don't quite know how and I don't know exactly when, but this is something I feel very strongly that I need to do on the basis of a 45-minute conversation. It was kind of bizarre. And I revisit that moment quite often and sort of um I'm surprised with how clear it was to me when
Right.
it happened. It was like, yeah, I need to do this. That had never happened to me before.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it was always inside you, and when it, actually that opportunity came through, your heart and, sort of you knew in your gut that this is it. So,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think part of that was timing, right? It was the right, my husband had established himself, he'd gotten tenure. We'd had our third child. Everybody was kind of in a stable position. We had some financial security. So it was possible to take a bit of a risk and to make a big pivot in terms of my own career. So it was also definitely a function of the timing. And if that conversation had happened maybe 3 years before, I wouldn't have been able to say, yes, I can do this.
right, right. So, Cheska, today Miracle Feed is in 37 countries, and it's a huge, huge organization. And you being the leader and sort of running operations on such a large scale, um, when you look back when you started and today when you are, such a big organization, how is the journey like? What are the lessons? If you can take us and especially the audience through something that is very valuable to learn from, and your experiences, frameworks, whether it concerns policies, governance, something to do with launching certain chapters in countries, dealing with people, especially. We would love to hear that.
That's a lot in one question, but I will try.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, I'm no longer running the organization, right? So I handed it over to a new CEO about 2 years ago, but I spent 13 years building it and starting it, building it and scaling it. So definitely put in place a lot of the current model and the tools that we needed in order to scale it. I think I mean, when I go back to what did I do and how did I approach it, my first response was to get a lot of information, right? To gather data, to talk to anybody and everybody that I could get in touch with who knew more than I did about Clubfoot, which was not saying much because this was completely new to me, right? So
Yeah.
talking to medical people, talking to public health people, talking to families who had Clubfoot in their family, and talking to other people that had built nonprofits that were addressing global health issues. So there was the initial kind of couple of months was really about just absorbing information and trying to get a lot. And I still use that approach in most things when I'm starting off something new. There's just this information gathering stage. And then the next thing I did to that I think is absolutely critical for anyone starting a nonprofit is to go sense check the feasibility of raising money against it. So once I had kind of confirmed what I thought Clubfoot meant and what the solution could be and why this mattered, I approached a few people and was really lucky. It was all friends and family that they all responded incredibly positively and actually committed funds at a very, very early stage because they agreed that this concept that this was an issue that really mattered and deserved some attention was compelling enough that they were willing to write a check. So that was a very validating stage to really not having done anything yet, but to be able to say, this is what I want to do. Will will you support me in trying to make this happen? And
Right.
just so lucky that three people responded very, very quickly. And that was hugely energizing to me and yeah, gave me a lot of confidence. The next step again, which I think is would I still kind of apply this in most things that I'm starting or when I'm trying to overcome a new problem, which was not to sit around and analyze the heck out of it, but to start acting. And so I went down to Brazil and I was very lucky, was given connections of some doctors that were involved in treating clubfoot down there, and just again absorbed information from the people who were on the front lines who were trying to solve the problem in their own country and asked them what were the hurdles and what did they need help with. Was there a role for an organization like MiracleFeet to support them in what they were doing? And I would, the generosity and the sort of openness of people who, when we had done nothing, we had no track record, I had zero credibility really, but people were just incredibly generous and kind and compassionate in terms of listening to me and helping me understand what the model should look like. So those early conversations of going down and surrounding myself with surrounding myself by those who were closest to it and had been struggling for years, well ahead of me, even hearing about Clubfoot and getting their views and their opinions and their input. That was what allowed us to create this partner-led model that became the crux of the organization. So going out and talking to those who are closest to the problem was absolutely critical, right? And then coming back and being able to really think in a quiet place with a blank sheet of paper, like, okay, so what does this mean? What should we do? Those were kind of the beginnings. The other couple of things that we put in place early on that I believe were critical, and full credit to other people for pushing me in this direction. But I had a conversation with the person who started Smile Train, which is the organization that's many times bigger than MiracleFeet, but addresses cleft palate in low and middle income countries. And he said it's absolutely critical that you collect patient treatment information, that you know whether you're delivering good quality care to children. Because unless the quality is there, you've got nothing, right? You might as
Yeah.
well go home. So from the absolute beginning, we realized that we needed to put in place metrics and a mechanism for collecting that information. And it sort of became part of MiracleFeet's DNA that we would be based on data and that we would make data-driven decisions. It really started with quality, though. It was like, how do we know? How are we going to know if we're making a difference? The only way to know we're making a difference is to follow a child and make sure that when they get into treatment, they end up being able to walk. So we developed very simple ways to do that. And although we've refined them a lot and built much more sophisticated data gathering and data analysis tools using new technology over the last 13 years, right? That has always been really central to who we were. And I think because we had that data and we had that reliance on patient information, obviously with a lot of concern for patient confidentiality and those kinds of things, that served us really well as we were trying to raise money because we had real evidence that we could point to, and we could reassure donors that we knew exactly what was happening with the money and we knew what was happening to these children and we were having the results that we thought we were having. And it also set us up for a model that was very scalable because you can't go check on every child and you can't go visit every clinic when you're in 37 different countries. You
Yeah.
need to have systems in place so that you can be sure that what you think is happening is actually happening. So some of those sort of early ideas put us on a path that I think secured a scalable, replicable model, which is why we've been able to have the impact that we've had. Does that answer the question? I'm sure there's a lot more that was going on, but those are some of the
Yeah.
key things that come to mind. I guess, sorry, I've missed a big part of it, which was also recognizing I had no medical experience. I had no public health experience. I had no program design experience. I was just someone who I was very good at strategic planning. I was very good at budgeting. I was very organized. I had a very sort of I had a lot of confidence that we could move this forward, even though a lot of people were like, what happens if you don't raise money? What happens if no one works for you? And I was like, we'll figure it out. We're going to do this. So I had that sort of that drive, but early on, we were lucky enough to hire amazing people who had done much more relevant work than I had done and had filled in all the gaps in terms of experience. So at the same time as figuring out the model, you need to figure out what are the skill sets and what's the expertise that we need to make this happen. And we achieved that by hiring amazing people who shared the vision and were willing to take a risk, because it all felt very risky and very tenuous in the early days, like, making commitments that we're going to support these programs without knowing where we were going to find the money, but being like, we have to do this, so we will find the money. And sure enough, we did.
Yeah, no, when you were actually telling the whole thing, the two, three key points that I really reflected on was that I think gathering that data was so important, and then even after the preliminary research that you did to make sure that every single child is tracked, because what you cannot measure, you cannot change or you cannot transform. And then building very set processes and systems in place which are scalable. I think that is something that maybe your previous experience with the companies that you work with and the strategic planning came handy. And then such an important point that you mentioned, Cheska, that hiring the right set of people. Sometimes people who have and bring in a lot more expertise in different domains than what you know of, because they're going to like then build upon that. So yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that with us. Moving forward from there, I think what I was reflecting was that you talked about systems and processes and people, but I'm sure that you also must have faced challenges on the way where systems broke or the processes didn't work out or people were not supportive. When you look back, could you share with us one or two of those experiences and what were the major learnings from them?
Yeah. So we definitely had challenges and we definitely had failures, some of which I take full responsibility for, or most of which I take full responsibility for. To probably the largest challenge was our track record of partnering in India. And we had two different partnerships that we ended up terminating in India. And obviously, India is an enormous country with a very high birth rate and a large population. So in
Yeah.
terms of when you think strategically about which country would be very important in solving the issue of Clubfoot, India is very high on that list. Our partnerships were always based on trust. We always developed a very close working relationship with our partners and continue to do that. And I I don't think it would be possible to be effective unless you have you're really working based on trust. At the same time, it's also important to make sure that there are shared expectations and that there are sort of targets that everybody's moving towards, and that it's very clear what information you expect and how you expect the partnership to work. And so we did have a fair number of processes and systems, but they developed over time. And we started off with what we thought was the minimum that we needed, and then when something goes wrong, you realize, oh gosh, we didn't think about this, we need to make it a bit more robust in this area or that area. So the two challenges that we faced with these partnerships in India were certainly, the first one was at a time where our grant agreements and the sort of contractual structure around the partnership was not as robust as it is now, because we've learned from that, and we have made it more robust. So
Yeah.
we were very reliant on the relationship and very trusting, but we also had very clear non-negotiables that we as an organization said we can't partner with someone who's not willing to meet us on these. That included our quality standards, that included sharing data, and it included reporting, and kind of following a budget, right? Where the money is, what we're providing funding for, and how that money should be spent. So those things were in place. Of course, when the partnership went wrong, we learned where there were vulnerabilities and where there were things that were not 100% clear, and where we should have been more, more had more of an explanation. So we learned a lot. Each time there was a failure, we improved. It fundamentally, though, didn't change my idea that without the trust, you don't have much. And I think what was upsetting about those partnerships was I think both sides felt like we did have good relationships and they still went sideways. So I think, what could we have done differently? More communication to catch it earlier. I think when you see a red flag, acting on it right away and really digging in and making sure, is there something going sideways here that we need to address, or is it okay to leave it? And I think there were some things where we were like would raise something and say this needs to get better, but it didn't and it didn't and it didn't, and then it becomes a much bigger problem. And being more insistent and more focused on addressing the little inkling of a problem before it gets bigger, that might
Yeah.
have saved us in both places. But there's also kind of it it was very clear because we did have a very strong understanding as an organization about what our non-negotiables were. When those were violated, which they were in both cases, it was very clear to us that we couldn't continue, right?
Right.
So we could try to fix it. We can say, okay, you have to adhere to these quality standards. That's non-negotiable. If on the other side they said we're not willing to, at some point you say, okay, so we can no longer work with you. And I think we were fortunate in having very clear non-negotiables. And so at the point where the other side said we're not willing to budge on these, we said, okay, our partnership is over and we can no longer work with you. If you change your mind, the door is open. If you want to come back and work with us on fixing the issues that we've identified as being problematic, we are very happy to do that. We want what's best for kids born with clubfoot in India, but there needs to be a point where you say, however strategic this is, if the partnership if there isn't alignment around the partnership, you shouldn't keep forcing it to work, right? Because you're going to have to make sacrifices or go against the values that you said are non not movable, right?
Yeah.
This is the core of who we are as an organization and as people. And if that doesn't work, then we need to just walk away. That was not easy though, and it was a tough decision. But I'm actually feel very proud in both cases that we said no. We need to
Yeah.
end this instead of saying this is so strategic. We don't care. We have to be in India. No, we should not be in India if we don't think that it's right for the organization.
Right. No, I just reflecting that sometimes saying no is more important than saying yes. And coming to the non-negotiables, one of the questions that I have for you, Chesca, is that for entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs who are starting in the social entrepreneurship journey with nonprofits, if they're scaling into different geographies and setting processes in place, according to you as a leader, as somebody who's built such a big, huge, massive organization, and of course with purpose and impact, what do you think are top five non-negotiables that um, people should look for and every organization must have, and or probably you had?
Hmm. Well, before I answer that, I want to add one more thing to the
Yep,
discussion, which
sure.
is one of the pieces that was always really important to Miracle Feet was
Hmm.
flexibility and making sure that our model was not so rigid that it only solved clubfoot in one way. Because every country is different, and when you talk to the medical leaders and the people who are facing or dealing with the issue of clubfoot, you
Yeah,
hear different needs and different concerns and hurdles that they need to overcome. And so we always said we have a basic model, and then we can do a lot of other things in addition to that.
right,
And we want to hear from you which pieces you need. And if you don't need training, for example, then we don't want to give you training. Or if you don't want us to provide our brace because you've got a local supplier, fine, you should be able to do that. So the model was always about flexibility, with the exception of these few non-negotiables, right? So I wanted to make sure because I feel like sometimes it could sound like we're imposing a solution, and we always were very clear that one solution does not fit every place. We yeah, so we want to hear from you what you need, and then we
Right.
can respond if we can. And if we can't, we're going to say, we actually don't have any experience in that, and we're not able to help you with that particular piece. So the non-negotiables was sort of just at the very core of it, and then there was a lot of flexibility around that, and that continues to exist today. The non-negotiables were what we all agreed on, were quality standards. So I think that sort of quality, especially with anything medical, is critical, right? But even with
Absolutely.
with most things, education, um, I don't know. Well, yeah, most things, the sort of if you're not going to do it well, you might as well not do it. So agreeing on the quality metrics and keeping them very simple so that they were actually they made sense in every condition, so that we
Right.
didn't tinker with them and tweak them so much for one particular set of conditions. They were really global metrics, and we worked with others outside MiracleFeet to establish those, so that we were all kind of shooting for the same thing. The idea that so yeah, agreeing on quality standards and then having a way to track that. And that was where the data, the collection of certain pieces of information was non-negotiable, and sharing that with us so that we all had eyes on that. Again, making sure confidentiality and any local laws around privacy and all of those things were adhered to. Those were really the two pieces of the two non-negotiables. The other piece, I guess there was a third piece that was that put up really strong guide rails for all of us, which was trying to have the most impact we could possibly have, which means trying to deliver treatment, high quality treatment for as low cost as possible. So we
Right.
looked at everything through a lens of cost per child. What is it costing us to deliver treatment? And that included the setting up the program and the training and all of the, additional pieces of the programmatic aspects, not just the treatment of one child. So from the very beginning, we always looked at what is it costing us to deliver treatment in this clinic, in this country, and globally, and making sure that we stuck to that. And if someone came in and said, we would love to work with you, but the cost per child is going to be 4 times what it is everywhere else, we would say, yeah, we can treat 4 times as many kids by putting that money in Tanzania than by putting it in this location. So we 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 were never, it was a consideration. There are many countries we work in where the costs are just naturally higher because the health systems are so underfunded that we have to provide more, and that's fine. So,
Yeah.
we're looking at averages, but having that knowledge and having some guidelines around what was acceptable in terms of cost was also an extremely helpful guiding principle. And so those sort of three things: data, quality metrics, and what it's costing you to deliver treatment, were very, very key and remain key to who we are.
Right. And I think data and the transparency of data, right? Like of sharing everything that's happening in that location, because when you go like huge as the organization went, you cannot literally track every clinic, every location manually, and then everything depends on the partnership and the trust that comes in with it. Um, yeah, thank you so much, Chesca, for sharing that. That's very valuable. And from that, a very important question that I have is that for all the challenges, and especially these challenges that you face, is there a framework that you personally use in life to overcome challenges, or whenever you're facing a problem, whether it's in life or professionally? And if you could, you know, yeah, share it with us.
So I think some of this we've talked about already, and I think I approach most things in the same way, and these are pretty simple. I'm sure most people do it in a similar way. But my first step is always to get the facts, right? To try to gather the data, the information, and get a clear sense for what has happened factually, right? And I know we can argue about what is fact and what is truth in today's world. It's more complicated, right? But I do think
Yeah,
there's usually a set of facts and
yeah,
pieces of data and information that you can collect. So that's sort of my number one response to when we have a challenge, is like, okay, let's get the facts on the table. The next thing I do is I'm someone who needs to cogitate on things for a while. So I like to gather a lot of information, or gather opinions and perspective from lots of different people, ideally on all, if there's a sort of disagreement over something on both sides of it, right? Let's try to hear lots of different opinions. And so I will be at the same time as gathering the data, trying to have conversations with everybody I think who knows something about this and can inform us. Then I start, that usually over a long run. When I go running, everything clicks into place in my head if I've got a lot of information that I'm trying to process. But I'll spend some quiet time trying to come up with what do I think are a couple of the solutions, right? What are some of the options on the table? And then I'm going to go back to maybe some of those same people, but other people that I respect or people who are advisors, board members, senior leaders within the organization, whomever, to get to sense check those and to kind of be like, I'm thinking of sort of, we've got sort of three options here, A, B, and C. This is A, this is B, this is C. What do you think? So trying to get, again, people who will critique and question maybe some of my assumptions, but I don't like to come out with one answer. I like to have sort of a range of solutions and then get people's views on it. And then ideally, based on that, I'm going to have to pick one, right? Again,
Yeah.
with input from my team, but at some point you have to kind of make a decision and move forward. But ideally, in a way that where you can pilot it, right? You can not spending forever getting the perfect solution or doing tons and tons of analysis on whether this is marginally better than this, but pick one and try it, and try it
Hmm.
in a very low key, less invasive, less investment required way, so that you can then refine it, right? And if you
Yeah.
make an error, you can wheel it back and it's not the end of the world because you didn't roll it out globally all at once, right? So, that sort of design thinking approach of coming up with some solutions pretty quickly and then, testing them and iterating on them is the way I usually like to do things. And throughout all of that, trying to communicate as much as possible. And sometimes that's not possible if it's an HR issue or it's something that is confidential, but I'm not great in those conditions. I really want to be telling everybody everything that's going on and sort of where we are in the process, because I just feel like then there's no surprise at the end when a decision is made. You're kind of
Right.
bringing people along through that process. So
Yeah.
data, hearing lots of opinions and hearing from all sides, then sense checking my ideas, and then trying to launch the solution in a small way, in a pilot way, so it can be refined and iterated on, and lots of communication across those processes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And from there, you also coach and mentor a lot of young leaders. So my next question would be, what is that one advice that you want to give to the young entrepreneurs and budding leaders that especially about the ones who are scaling their ventures in different geographies or in general? Because I think that's where the real challenges start coming in. When the company or the organization is small, everything is, can be managed, even micromanaged. But when you go on a scale, things get messier. And then that's where the real challenge and opportunity comes in.
Right. I think so. I've been working mentoring a number of new founders of early stage organizations and CEOs. And I think one of the things I can be most helpful in is teeing up the next problem that they need to solve, right? So that things are going okay. They've got that, you know, sometimes that coaching is about problem solving, and then it's fine. It's like, I've got a crisis, this has gone wrong, that's gone wrong, and we can work through that. But often it's actually, okay, things seem really, really good. Everything seems to be working. Here are three things that you don't know you need to do that are going to be the next things that are going to come up. So it's kind of taking the surprise out of, like, often when you're in the thick of building especially the startup phase, right? You have so much going on and you've got so much worrying about raising the money and trying to have impact, and you're doing it all at once, and you're so in the weeds that it's often hard to imagine that, oh gosh, actually, we need to be investing a significant amount of money on some data system that's going to allow us to go from where we are now to 10x, right? And it's always way earlier than you think you need it. You need to start working on it way earlier than you realize you need to. Even small things like once you hire one person and it's probably a couple of in the early stages, there's quite a long time between hiring people because it's so expensive and you're adding to the team and so forth. But as you start scaling, suddenly you're hiring lots of people. And unless you started to put in place, you know, how are we going to do our interviews? How do we onboard somebody when they come? We need benefits. We need this. We need that. It suddenly all comes at once. And so being able to give people a heads up and say, I know this seems premature because there's only 5 of you, but you're going to go from 5 to 25 incredibly quickly. And you need to start putting in place some of these systems and processes, which if you're anything like me as a founder, you resist, right? Because
Right.
I don't, I'm an entrepreneur. I don't love systems and processes. We've talked a lot about them because I've learned over
Yeah.
time that they're absolutely essential, right? But they don't come easily to those of us, I think, who are the entrepreneurs because, we're flying by the seat of our pants. We're making it up. We don't want to be bound by rules and policies. And so it's often kind of explaining why you need to start thinking about putting in, buying a CRM so you can track your
Yeah.
donors. Well, it's fine. I'm using an Excel spreadsheet. I've only got 20 of them. It's working fine right now. Yeah, but when you go from 20 to 100, everything changes. So
Yeah.
it's giving people a bit of lead time on thinking through what are the next problems that are going to come down the pike that I have to solve that are more about building the entity and the organization versus scaling impact, right? They're the infrastructure that's needed so the impact can happen.
Right. Yeah.
So that's kind of the you asked it was the one piece of advice, and that's not a good answer to that. It's the general role I feel like as a coach I can help play. Um,
No,
there's
I
enough, I
think
guess.
that's
Yeah,
no, I think that's very important, Cheska, to be able to understand and, see the future possibilities and start early because what happens is that when you scale and suddenly things are not aligned or you do not have processes in place, it can get messier. So,
right.
yes. But if there's something you would like to add more to it, please do.
Well,
Sorry.
I guess I was sort of thinking I wasn't sure whether you were asking about process or about sort of one nugget of something to keep in mind. And I guess to me, you raised it earlier, but always being transparent. I mean, just honesty and transparency get you so far
Yeah.
in especially in the world of social impact. And I think just starting off on that track and with that practice of just being really transparent about everything with your partners, with your employees, with your team, and especially with your donors and your board, it just makes life so much easier.
Yeah. No, you just answered the rapid fire first question that
Okay.
what is the value that you keep center and at front when you do go into partnerships? And I think you would keep it as
Absolutely. Yeah.
honesty.
Yeah, I just and it's transparency and honesty, I guess, because they are slightly different, but I put them together because I think um, it's easier. Honesty seems like a loaded value, while transparency doesn't seem so loaded, and I really mean it in the best way. But just being able to be honest and truthful about everything that you're doing um, just means everybody's on the same page, and that transparency much simpler than have I told them this thing or have I told life's too short.
Yeah. No, I am totally 100% with you on that. Um, is there one strategic decision that you remember that changed the path of the project or anything that you were doing completely? And what were the
Well,
consequences?
I think realizing, well, early on when we realized that we had to rely on local partners, that was, I don't think we realized the gravity of that piece of the model until much later and
Right.
how key that was to our success. If we had tried to impose something from the US in each country would never have worked. It seemed to me at the time really obvious that we had to work with local partners, but now, kind of, 10 years later, 13 years later, it's amazing to me how many organizations have not done that. And now there is more
Yeah.
pressure, particularly from the philanthropic world, uh, that we need to be working with whoever's closest to the problem to solve it effectively. I mean, that's kind of like become a norm and a requirement. But when we fell on that model, we didn't do it because everybody said that's the most effective way to do it. It just made sense. I was like, how else are we going to do this? The treatment requires people to come back many times. You can't fly doctors in and treat these kids and then leave. That just doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
So it made no sense not to do it. But at the same time, the fact that we figured that out so early and then everything else was built around that, was an absolutely pivotal decision. But at the time just seemed obvious. But now it's kind of like, well, thank goodness we did that because nothing else would have worked. So
Yeah.
I think I would point to that as the kind of the key to our success. We would not be talking today if we hadn't early on built everything around local partnerships.
Right. Is there anything you keep as a priority when you go into partnerships, when we talk about the first conversations or putting as a principle, putting it first, to make sure that the partnership, especially between people, I mean, when you talk to people, when you interact with people, it builds that trust and transparency in the first meetings, first few meetings itself.
Yeah, I think just being yourself, being authentic is
Yeah.
really the easiest way to build trust, right? Coming in as yourself, not as the CEO of MiracleFeet, not as somebody who's asking a big favor of the Minister of Health, but coming in as just being really authentic. I'm doing this
Yeah.
because I really care about these kids. I'm sure, and we're here to see if this is of interest to you and see if we can help you. But not coming conceived ideas, but just really being straightforward, honest, authentic. Again, it's the transparency piece, I
Yeah.
think, but keeping things simple and keeping things authentic so that you're not, there's no mysteries, there's no hidden agendas. It's just kind of plain and simple language, no jargon, not trying to come across as overly sophisticated. Just be yourself. And that doesn't always work, but when it does work, it works really well.
From a first meeting itself, the first thing that I noticed about you, and it really, really is something that I mean, I admire about you, is that there's so much humility, Jessica, that you've done so much, but then, like you said, that authenticity and that simplicity, it's very striking. But what you pointed out too, that it doesn't work always, but when it works brilliantly well. And I think for projects like this, especially for projects which have impact, purpose. But I also feel that in the corporate life, also, if you bring authenticity, I think, and transparency, most things are bound to succeed and work out.
Yeah, well,
Um,
thank you. Yeah, I think that's right. I hope that's right. It makes me feel better about the world that we can be authentic, right? We don't have
yeah.
to dress ourselves up into something that we're not in order to impress or to convince people that we're worthy of a partnership or working with them, but you can be yourself.
So that just says why Miracle Feet is where it is today, has impacted 100,000 plus lives. It's just, if you were to look back in the hindsight as a child, who would have thought that you would be here today? Already made a difference to 100,000 plus children. It's such a big thing. Many of us just dream of helping even one child, and suggest that this is just what you have done is, yeah, way beyond the numbers and the big what do you say the big show biz that we see with corporate uh, you know mainstream careers.
Yeah.
My
Well,
last
thank you.
question to you would be, Jessica, that what is next for MiracleFeet. Um, and I would love you to leave our listeners with one last message that you would like to share with them.
So what's next for MiracleFeet? Well, MiracleFeet has a wonderful new CEO that I helped recruit and who I worked with closely for 2 years before she took over. She shares a lot of the same values that I share, and I think the model, she has embraced the basic model, but also made improvements and it continues to evolve. So our hope, our combined hope, I'm still on the board, is that we end the disability caused by untreated clubfoot in the next 15 to 20 years by continuing to scale MiracleFeet. It's really about raising enough money to replicate and scale what we're doing. And this really is no other, there's nothing else that should really hold it back. So it's something that
Right.
we truly believe can happen. I guess my one message to people is give it a go, right? If you think there's something there that you can do to make a difference in this world and have impact, there is nothing more rewarding than the work that I've done. I feel so incredibly lucky to have done this work, and it's so with the help of so many people. But I also feel like there was a moment where I could like go or not go. And thank goodness I went. And I just would encourage everybody to, if there's an inkling, if there's a feeling, if you have this like little, like, I'd really like to try this, the worst thing is it doesn't work. And
Yeah.
that's not so bad, right? If you give it your best and it doesn't work, you can sleep well at night. If you never try, you're always going to have regrets. And so I just look back and think how lucky it was that I decided to give this a go, and here we are with I think 113,000 children now who've been impacted with so much help from so many people. But there was that sort of, was I brave enough? So be brave, everybody. The world needs it.
Well, that's such a beautiful message, being brave and putting things into action. You know what, like the last thing that I want to say is that when you said that, just go and start it, don't overanalyze, and then you can always pivot. You can always try. That was such an important lesson. So be brave and take the action. Thank you so much, Cheska, for taking out time for us and doing this podcast. This was such a valuable lessons that you shared with us. Thanks a lot for today.
Thank you so much for spreading awareness of the work we do and giving me the chance to think about some of the whys and hows. I don't often do that, so I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you. And I hope
Thanks,
that we
Surata.
do another conversation soon.
Great. Me too. Thanks for
Thank
your
you.
great work and for highlighting these inspiring stories.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.